Hey, Laracon you, how's it going? Are you enjoying the conference? Yeah, great. My name is Ryuta Hamasaki. I came from Japan. It took around 12 hours to come here, so I still have a jet lag. So I'm sorry if I get asleep during my talk. So I am a software developer at Laracon, which is an e-commerce and media company in Japan. So we're creating our e-commerce platform using Laravel for about 5 years now. That includes the customer-facing side and the internal admin system to manage orders, products, stocks, and more. If you're looking for a Laravel job in Japan, just come and talk to me. We're using Laravel Mix to build assets like ES6 JavaScript, Vue single file components, and Sass. Is anybody using Laravel Mix? Oh, most of you. Awesome. Who of you are using CDN to serve assets? Almost 50%. Great. Last question. Who of you are using Laravel Mix in conjunction with CDN? OK, I see a few hands. Laravel Mix is a great tool for building assets for Laravel applications. It works out of the box for many use cases. However, in real-world applications, which have high traffic or global audiences, we often need to serve assets from a CDN for the purpose of the performance gain. But Laravel Mix doesn't support uploading and serving assets from CloudFront or S3, that kind of CDN. Wouldn't it be nice if we could use Laravel Mix in conjunction with a CDN? Actually, we can achieve this by customizing Laravel Mix configurations, but it's not straightforward to make it work with the CDN caching mechanism. Caching allows us to reuse the resource that we previously fetched from the server, but when we update the cached contents, we have to implement a proper cache busting strategy. Otherwise, we might end up serving a stale asset to the client. It's like a cheese shop that serves the moldy cheese to the customers. I know we can eat some cheese with mold, but I don't want to serve stale assets to the customers of our application. Today, I'm going to talk about how to use Laravel Mix to serve assets with proper cache busting strategy, as well as some pitfalls that I encountered in my real applications. In this talk, we're going to use Amazon CloudFront and S3 as an example, but this talk can be applied to other CDNs as well. So let's start by looking at the default config for Laravel Mix. It just compiles the Sass and JavaScript in the resource folder and puts the output into the public folder. That's it. Pretty simple. However, Laravel Mix doesn't support uploading assets to the external servers like S3. So we need an additional setup for this. First, let's install Webpack S3 plugin. This is a Webpack plugin to upload the output files to S3. To use the plugin, in the config file, import the plugin and then call Webpack config method. That allows us to merge any sort of Webpack configuration overrides. Here, we initialize S3 plugin and push it to the plugins array of Webpack config. It should be applied only for a production build, since we don't want to upload the assets in our local development environment. Now, let's look into the S3 plugin initialization more deeper. There are several options like this. First, it uploads the CSS and JS files in the public folder. And in the S3 options, we specify AWS credentials from the environment variable. And here, we specify S3 bucket and cache control. Cache control is a response header to control for how long the response should be cached. This time, we set max age to 1 year, represented in seconds, to take advantage of the caching as much as possible. And since we set public, the intermediate proxy servers like CDN will also cache the response from the origin servers like S3. Now, if we build assets for development, it just compiles the asset but doesn't upload to the external servers, in this case, S3. On the other hand, if we build assets for production, it builds assets and then uploads to S3. Let's see how it works when we load the page on the browser. For example, when the browser makes a request to apps.js, the CDN, in this case CloudFront, returns a response with cache control header as we specified when uploading to S3. As a result, the browser caches the content for a year. Next time we load the page on the browser, it retrieves the content from the cache, and so it never makes a request to the server unless the cache expires or the content is removed from the cache. Now we can reuse the resource that we previously fetched from the server. But what if we want to update the cached content before the cache expires? Let's say we told the browser to cache the content for a year, but after that, we need to update it to add a new feature to the application. We can achieve this by changing the URL of the resource and force the browser to download a new asset from the server. It's called cache busting. Typically, we do this by embedding a fingerprint of the file content in its file name or in the query string parameter. With Laravel Mix, we can achieve this by using version method, like this. It appends a unique version hash as a query string parameter, like this. Laravel Mix generates mixed manifest JSON file that includes the mapping between the original file name and the version file name. A version hash is uniquely generated from the file content. Therefore, it never changes unless the file content is updated. But how do we know the version file name in the Blade template? I think most of you know the answer. Yes, Laravel ships with mix helper function, which inspects the manifest JSON file and returns the version file name. However, it just returns the relative path from the web server where Laravel application is running. So how do we reference the asset URL on the CDN? What came to my mind first was to implement a custom helper function by myself. But thanks to Taylor, since Laravel 5.7.14, we can use asset helper function that allows us to prepend the CDN-based URL to each asset file path. To use the asset helper function, we set asset URL environment variable, which should be referenced by app.php config file And then if we wrap mix function call with the asset function, it returns the full URL on the CDN with the version hash. Now, when we load the page on the browser, it retrieves the content from the CDN with version hash parameter. And also, browser caching is working well because of the cache control header. What about development environment? We usually want to reference the local asset in the development environment, right? Actually, we just need to set asset URL to blank and set up URL to your local server's URL. And then asset function returns the local asset URL like this. Awesome. Let's push the changes and go home. But the next day, my boss came to me and said, hey, I've heard that we released a new feature, but the website doesn't seem to be updated. What's going on? I'm sorry, boss. I'll investigate the issue now. What happened? Even though we deployed a new version of our application, it was still referencing the previous version of asset. Why? We set the version hash for cache busting, right? In fact, there is a pitfall in query string-based versioning. What I noticed was that some CDNs, including CloudFront, do not cache the contents based on query string parameters by default. Let's say, if the browser makes a request to app.js with version hash blah, 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 CloudFront will fetch the content from S3. However, CloudFront strips the query string and creates a cache just as app.js, which doesn't include the query string. And then we deployed a new version of app.js to S3. After that, when we load the page again, the browser makes another request with different version hash to fetch the fresh content from the server. However, CloudFront ignores the ID parameter and retrieves the content from the cache, even though the master file has been updated on S3. As a result, it ends up serving a stale content back to the browser. What can we do? The good news is that we can configure CloudFront so that it can cache the content based on query string parameters. Here's the CloudFront console on AWS. Now click on the distribution ID you want to edit, and then in the Behaviors tab, select the behavior and click the Edit button. And here, query string forwarding and caching is disabled. That's why it ignores the query string. So let's select forward all cache based on whitelist, and then add the ID parameter to the whitelist. All right, let's go back to the previous example again. The browser makes a request to app.js with version hash. CloudFront will fetch the content from S3. This time, CloudFront respects the ID parameter, and it creates a cache as app.js with version hash. And then we deploy a new version of app.js to S3. After that, when we load the page again, the browser makes another request to app.js with different version hash. Now, CloudFront cannot find the content in the cache because the version hash is different. And so it fetches the fresh content from S3. Finally, CloudFront creates a separate cache for each query string and returns the fresh content back to the browser. In this example, we are using CloudFront, but other CDN providers have similar settings. Awesome. With this setup, our application has been working pretty well for a couple of months. So I went on a vacation. But after the vacation, my boss came to me again and said, hey, while you were on the vacation, we couldn't update the assets again. What's going on? I'm sorry, boss. I'll investigate the issue now again. After the investigation, what I noticed was that in some cases, S3 might return the previous version of object. I was shocked when I noticed that, but it's related how S3 stores its data. Amazon S3 achieves high availability by replicating its data across multiple servers within Amazon's data centers. If we replace the existing object on S3, the information about the change must replicate across the data centers. So if CloudFront tries to retrieve the content from S3 before the change is fully propagated, S3 will return the previous version of object. Let's take a look at the previous example again. This time, we skipped the request from the browser since it's all the same as before. Again, CloudFront sends a request to app.js with version hash. And it caches the response as app.js with version hash like this. And then we deploy a new version of app.js to S3, which replaces the existing object on S3. At this point, the change has not been propagated yet. So if CloudFront makes another request before the change is propagated, S3 will return the previous version of data. The worst scenario is that CloudFront creates a new cache with the old data, which will never be updated unless the cache expires or is manually invalidated. From this experience, I learned that it's not a good idea to stick to query string-based versioning when we use a CDN. So what can we do? This issue was caused by replacing the existing object on S3. As long as we stick to query string-based versioning, the file name itself never changes. But don't worry. There is another option to achieve cache busting, and it's file name-based versioning. With file name-based versioning, version hash is included in the file name itself, so when we update the object on S3, it never replaces the existing object, because the file name changes every time we update the file content. And so we don't have to worry about receiving the previous version of object from S3. Sounds great. But how can we achieve this with Laravel Mix? Laravel Mix doesn't support file name-based versioning. In fact, Laravel Mix used to support file name-based versioning, but for some reason, it switched to query string-based versioning. So some people created a pull request to reintroduce file name-based versioning, but Jeffrey Webb, creator of Laravel Mix, suggested to introduce file name-based versioning as a plugin. So they created plugins to switch from query string-based versioning to file name-based versioning. Today, we're going to use one of the plugins, which is called Laravel Mix version hash. This plugin overrides the underlying underlying Webpack config so that we can include the version hash in the file name. So let's give it a try. Actually, it's pretty easy to implement. All we have to do is just import the plugin, and instead of calling the built-in version method, we call version hash method that plugin provides. That's it. Now, we can include the version hash in each file name like this. So finally, by introducing file name-based versioning, we can use Laravel Mix in a good harmony with CDN. And finally, my boss is happy now. But how about you? Are you happy with this solution? For me, I'm happy so far. But some of you might be thinking like, it's kind of risky to use the unofficial plugins because they might be incompatible with the latest version of Laravel Mix in the future. If you don't want to use the unofficial plugins like this, but still needs file name-based versioning, you can use Webpack directly. Webpack has so many features that you have a full control of how to build your assets. Also, file name-based versioning is pretty easy to implement with Webpack. But at the same time, it comes with a steep learning curve. So you have to configure a lot of things that Laravel Mix does for us behind the scene. If you don't want to mess around Webpack, but still need file name-based versioning, there are other options. Those options are JS framework CLIs, such as Vue CLI, Angular CLI, Create React App, and so on. If you create a standalone single-page applications and Laravel just provides the backend APIs, it could be better to use this kind of CLIs. Those CLIs provide many useful features like testing, linting, TypeScript, PWA, and more. And also, most of them support file name-based versioning by default, which is CDN-friendly. When I attended Laracon US last year, Evan Yu, the creator of Vue.js, introduced how to integrate Vue CLI with Laravel. If you are interested, the video is available on YouTube. Now, let me wrap up my talk. Cache busting is really important for updating the cached content whenever you want. And there are two options to achieve cache busting. The first is query string-based versioning, and the other one is file name-based versioning. Query string-based versioning is good enough if you don't use CDN. However, if you use a CDN, stick to file name-based versioning. Otherwise, you might end up serving stale content to the client. And if you don't want to use the plugins, you can use an Webpack directory or JS framework CLIs, which helps you scaffold some boilerplates. And that's it. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, just come and talk to me. Enjoy the rest of the conference.